Oh, I think we are live actually. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. I think I botched the introduction, but no worries.
Hmm.
I am here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am here, of course, with special guest Lawrence Wilkerson, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a retired Army colonel. He is also he worked under Colin Powell in the Secretary of in the Department of State. So, Lawrence Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad I could be with you.
Great. So let us just get right started. Everybody, as you're coming on, make sure you hit that like button. That helps boost the stream and the algorithm. Of course, you can find all the ways to support this show in the video description. So, Colonel Wilkerson, let us get started with what happened to Scott Ritter, friend of this show. Now, his prevention by the Department of State comes as there have been many announcements from the United States and NATO around escalations, greenlighting Ukraine's use of long-range missiles into Russian territory, and then a leaked report about NATO forming land corridors through Europe to rush to the Russian border in case of an eventual war between NATO and Russia. How do you see Scott Ritter's persecution by the Department of State within the context of this overall conflict going on in Ukraine?
Let me pick up on your last comment before I go to that. NATO rushing anything, armored columns, battalions of infantry, air defense, is just stunning to me. Well coordinated towards anybody's border. The business with Ritter is really disturbing. As I said on another interview of yesterday or day before, I got stopped going to Cuba when I was actually working track 2 diplomacy for President Obama, trying to bring about a rapprochement with Cuba. We had gotten to the point where we could, out of Miami, travel regularly, but it was onerous. It was difficult because they would always throw up something. Several times, and one time in particular, I had the same thing happen to me that Scott did. And I don't know, I was just in possession of my faculties. So I challenged the gentleman who presented himself as being from Customs and Border Patrol. And I told him what I was doing. And he took my documents for a while. I was really worried. And he came back and he said, "Okay, you're cleared. Go ahead." I don't know what he did, but this is the kind of way they operate. And with Scott, it was even more egregious. It was worse because they confiscated his only travel document, his American passport, and they didn't give him a receipt. And as I heard it told by Scott and others, they didn't actually know who had given them the instructions to do what they were doing, including within the Customs and Border Patrol, who have an office there at JFK where Scott was transporting himself through. So it just smacks of amateur hour. It smacks of last minute attempt to do something to derail Scott's legitimate trip to this Petersburg economic conference. And as Judge Napolitano pointed out on his show numerous times, it violates at least half a dozen of the constitutional provisions for protection of American citizens, not least of which is you can't do that without a valid warrant or without just cause, reasonable cause, we call it, or even reasonable suspicion. And what was the reasonable suspicion of, if there was even reasonable suspicion? And why was there no redress? Now, the question comes to me, it's very difficult. He's been robbed of his ability to travel now, which is another abridgment of the Constitution, without due course. So how does he get his passport back? He doesn't even really know, other than Anthony Blinken, who took it. And he doesn't even really know why they took it, other than the speculation, and I think it's more than speculation, that this group formed in Ukraine with U.S. connivance and monetary support, that invented this new term, information terrorism, has caused a new regime to exist, one perhaps even more onerous than the one we put in place during the time I was serving President George W. Bush. And we had prisoners galore who were innocent of anything other than being fought on the battlefield in Guantanamo. So my question to myself as I was listening to this explanation was, okay, when do they start showing up in Guantanamo? When indeed do I show up in Guantanamo as a quote information terrorist? This is absolute malarkey, but it's very dangerous malarkey, and Scott is maybe one of the first victims of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you were the former chief of staff to Colin Powell. You've been on the inside here. Could you talk about this, given that this is happening at such a key moment, it feels like, in the US's overall foreign policy, if we can even call it a strategy, in Ukraine toward Russia. Vladimir Putin has said that the response to all of these escalations, this kind of rolling escalation of late, especially with the green lighting of US and NATO weapons onto Russian territory, that the response could be asymmetric warfare. From your knowledge and what you've been studying with regard to this conflict, and of course your experience, what could he mean here in terms of Russia's response to this crossing, or this latest crossing of Russia's red line?
I hope he just means that he's making a point, a valid point, that he has other weapons at his disposal, if you will. But since Russian doctrine in the 2013, 2014, 2015 period, which the Finns and the Swedes and the Swiss were studying, they had observers on the battlefield, as I recall. And some of them came to America, I think it was 2012 or 2013, and I happened to be in the briefing that they gave on the development of Russian doctrine. Among other things, they alerted us to the fact that taking shape, and now has taken shape, is a doctrinal statement within the Russian body of doctrine that should a country, and you know who they mean, achieve a penetration within the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is their equivalent of NATO, Russia being the most prominent member, as we are the most prominent member of NATO, a penetration into that CSTO area because of the overwhelming advantage, and here you know it's NATO, of precision guided munitions at that time as compared to Russia. Russia would simply blunt the point of the attack or the flanks of the attack, perhaps both, and maybe even some of the rear area with tactical nuclear weapons. People tried to scream at me and tell me that this is when I revealed this, it wasn't classified. It was a briefing by our friends and allies. When I tried to reveal this in some places where neocons hung out, they were like, "Oh, that's crap. The Russians haven't got a doctrine of nuclear use like that. That would be first use." I said, "Yeah, well, you better hope that's the case if you're planning on invading the CSTO, because I take them at their word." Well, Putin's now saying that's the word. Putin's now saying that if you were to start this thing on a regional basis with NATO as a major partner in the now lost to Russia Ukraine conflict, it would change the power equation. And as the Russians used to say when they were the Soviet Union, it would change the correlation of forces. Therefore, I would be perfectly within my right to do whatever I want to with your invasion or your attack or your augmentation of Ukraine. Now let's back up and look at something else. He's had the right under the understood laws of war for some time to attack NATO countries. Anywhere someone is being trained in an F-16 or in a Leopard tank or in a Centurion tank or whatever, in London, in Poland, in the Baltic states, wherever this is happening, or anywhere where munitions are being produced at plants in NATO countries or any country that are being introduced into the Ukraine conflict and then fired at Russian forces or used on Russian forces, they have a right to attack that plant or that airfield or that training facility. Their perfect right to do so because it's being used against them. Now, they're arguing essentially what we're arguing now, that if Russia's attacking from out of the homeland, the motherland, then Ukraine ought to be allowed to hit targets in the motherland. I'd buy that argument if it was Ukrainian produced munitions, but it's not. It's munitions in large part and billions of dollars from the United States in particular, but also from the EU coming into Ukraine from outside. So now you've opened this thing up. So Putin has been very restrained. He could have hit these places. Now, I'm sure he's thinking he does not want to escalate. He has been so systematic in saying that what he's doing in Ukraine has nothing to do with territorial aggrandizement, other than he has to take the territory to protect his citizens in Ukraine. That's his rationale. He does not want Ukraine. He does not want to have to manage it post hostilities. He knows that would be catastrophic. The Ukrainians have produced some of the most bloodthirsty guerrillas in the history of warfare over the last 200 years alone. He knows he doesn't want that territory. He couldn't manage it. He's not interested in territory. He's interested in security. He's made that point all along. And lately, he's been making the point that he's ready to talk. And he's ready to talk as long as he's allowed to sit down at the other end of the table. I mean, this business of going to Switzerland, for example, without Russia is absurd. It's absurd. And the rest of the world is deeming it absurd because they're not coming. I like Lula's statement. Why would I want to go? Russia's not going to be there. This is true nonsense, really, and it's nonsense more or less manifested by the United States of America, and to a large extent, its poodle dog, London.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And what's so interesting about this too is that, as you said, not only has Putin been very clear that it's not about territory, but you also have on the other side a pretty big lack of clarity. For example, I don't know if you caught Joe Biden's very incoherent interview with Time magazine, but in that interview, he was very defensive when it was suggested that it's a troubling time in the conflict for NATO and for the United States with regard to Ukraine. And he immediately said, "What are you talking about? Russia's military is decimated." Colonel Wilkerson, could you clarify what could Joe Biden be thinking here when he says these words, if anything at all? And what is the reality of the situation then? Because it seems to be pretty far from what Joe Biden is asserting to Time magazine and what he's been asserting since the beginning of this conflict.
I have a hard time believing that a coherent and thinking president of the United States would say things like that. So I have to believe one of two things. Either he's not coherent and not thinking clear-headedly. He's, as Barbara Tuchman so famously said about World War I, he's wooden-headed. Or, and I tend to come down on this latter reason, or a combination of the two, but more emphasis on this latter reason, his advisors are fools. And since I know that Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are fools, I come down, as I said, pretty hard on that side. And he's only getting his information from fools. Now, let me add to that. The 4 stars in the armed forces of the United States, who are a basket case of wooden-headedness and stupidity. Just look at what they've been doing of late. 26 out of 32, 80% of the recently retiring flag officers at that rank level went to military contractors post-retirement. This is their dream. This is their glory. Look at Admiral Burke, who used to boast that he commanded more maritime forces. He was commander of all the NATO naval forces than Horatio Nelson. Well, I have news for him. One thing is historical analogy is kind of stupid because the French fleet was a lot bigger than Horatio Nelson's. So I would have said bigger than Napoleon's fleet, not Horatio Nelson's. But nonetheless, now he's up on charges. It looks like he's been involved in corruption and been offered a $500,000 a year job because of that corruption after his retirement. Now, this guy, I thought, was one of the last 4 stars in the United States Navy that was worth a damn. Now I've got to revisit that opinion completely and cast him with the rest of the fools. Look at Afghanistan. 20 years, no one held to account. No one fired, no one ripped up. One person was sort of pseudo fired, but and then look at Iraq, all the 4 stars there, the 3 stars there that came home and were service chiefs or something else, got their promotions, got their big job in the military industrial complex. No one punished, no one held accountable. We have fools running the United States military today. So I got to believe that Biden is getting a whole plate full of really bad advice. You had David Petraeus out there months ago saying there was no way Russia was going to prevail. Ukraine was going to prevail. Well, David, I'm sorry. I knew you lied about Iraq when you were telling me at the State Department that Iraqi battalions were ready for action. And my spy in Baghdad was telling me that 10 to 30% on any given day of your Iraqi battalions were AWOL. So I know David Petraeus lies for a profession, but it's a combination of things like that. The remarks that Biden made are simply absurd. Look at the correlation of forces once again, which I was looking at on the day of the invasion and said, no way, Ukraine prevails, not unless NATO in force joins it, and then it'll be touch and go, because it's 140 to 150 million nation with 11 time zones and a latent industrial base that now is cooking on all 8 cylinders, by the way, against less than 40 million who most of their industrial base was shipped off to the new Russia once the Soviet Union stood down, along with their nuclear weapons. And what remained in Ukraine was producing heavy equipment and such for the Russians. So this is absurd for any military professional, unless he's interested in politics and interested in getting a really good, well-paying job in the military-industrial complex, who, by the way, are making billions off this Ukraine conflict. Unless that's his motivation, it's absolute insanity for him to stand up there and say, with that correlation of forces, that Ukraine is going to prevail. No way Ukraine is going to prevail. So to have the president at this late moment, I looked at a map yesterday of what the Russians have right now and what they could take within the next 30 to 60 days. Port of Odessa is going to fall. Ukraine then will have no port on the Black Sea. Forget about trying to ship your grain and other things out, because if the Russians want to stop you, they'll stop you. They will own all the ports. You'll have to use trains and buses and trucks and everything else. And no one in the EU is going to like that, because then you're going to be competing with their farmers, and that's going to cause a real problem. This is a nightmare taking shape that the United States has largely crafted, along with, I can't leave this out ever, its British poodle, and Rishi Sunak in particular, but the guys before him too. This is a disaster. And we need to recognize that and call for a ceasefire, which Putin, I'm sure, will agree to. Listened to him this morning, driving back from Annapolis. I listened to him. And he essentially said that as long as he got a seat at the table and was able to prevail in the serious matters that he considers serious, at least partially, if not wholly, he's willing to do it. He's willing to sit down. I know he's said so many times what those serious matters are. That should be no problem for us, other than we have to eat a lot of crow because it'll look like we lost. And I fear at the end of the day, that might be Biden's motivation. He is so scared, as Lyndon Baines Johnson was, of getting branded by the American people as a cutter and runner from a conflict. He cut and run from Ukraine after saying all these things about it, essential, existential, and so forth. It's Hitler all over again and so forth, calling Putin that. After saying all those things, then sitting down after a ceasefire and negotiating a peace, which will be at least 50-50, if not 60-40 for Russia, that might cost him the election in November. And that is the only thing Joe Biden really cares about. Not America, not democracy, liberal or otherwise, not our real security. If he cared about a real security, he wouldn't be bogged down in Ukraine and Gaza through proxies, but nonetheless bogged down monetarily and equipment-wise. If he cared, he wouldn't be in either of these conflicts the way he is. He'd be focused entirely on China, and he'd be building up the U.S. armed forces to meet China if it has to someday in the future. He's not doing that. So he is interested in one thing and only one thing: getting reelected.
Yeah, and I mean, what you said is critical, and it's interesting because Putin and Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson of the Russian Federation, said that this is a change. What they announced in terms of how the response could be to the to these escalations. It's a change in Russia's foreign policy, and and what I think I gleaned from that was that the change is that Russia generally stays out of anything regional, anything. Its foreign policy is not offensive, so to speak, and it's framed its special military operation as defensive from the beginning. So my last question to you about Ukraine, then, Colonel Wilkerson, is how close exactly are we to a kind of World War III scenario playing out here? Because we've seen Russia doing tactical nuclear drills. I have reported here about, certain Russian think tanks and policy strategists talk about what would it mean to test out a nuclear weapon, a strategic nuclear weapon, to show that they have them and they exist. Maybe put a mushroom cloud up somewhere far far away for the United States and NATO to view and get onto camera, so they have confirmation that these weapons exist in Russia's arsenal. How close are we then to this kind of doomsday scenario? Because it seems like I've been saying on this channel that it feels like while the United States and NATO are not necessarily rushing, they're putting in the foundation for this step by step, especially as this conflict looks bleaker and bleaker for their side.
Those are all good points, and I worry about each of them almost on a daily basis. I know, although I can't ferret out the actual specifics that we're talking right now. And I'm being told that we're talking mostly about prisoner exchanges. And when I say talking, we've got people who really know how to do diplomacy, like Bill Burns, involved. And we've got the good offices of Oman and other places that want to see this stop. So if that is serious talking and it expands into talk about a ceasefire and ultimately a conclusion to this conflict, that's good. And that's my most ardent wish. But at the same time, I have to say I don't expect that because I've seen nothing out of this administration but idiocy. And what you're talking about with regard to nuclear weapons could come about even if what I said preliminarily is true, that we are talking and that we might finally achieve something that would lead to real talks. You're looking at a situation where a lot of things have happened in the last 30 years in particular. And boy, have I noticed this because I'm 80 and I grew up during the Cold War. I grew up when Lyndon Johnson put out a pamphlet, for example, that I used to share with my George Washington University and my William and Mary students who were shocked. The pamphlet told you how to build a bomb shelter in your backyard. It was an official government pamphlet. And it told you how to stock it, how to put the right water amount in there, how to put food in there, the survival food you get. It was all about people understanding, at least intuitively, if not intellectually, that you could disappear. A mushroom cloud or two or three or 100 might show up at any moment, and your life would be over, and all your neighbors' lives would be over. Your state would be wiped out, and maybe your country. Now, you'd wipe the other side out too, because it would be a general strategic exchange of 30,000 warheads on both sides. But they understood this, and that's gone, totally gone. Not only is it totally gone, not only do the American people not even think about this sort of prospect anymore, we have ourselves, Washington, destroyed every single treaty regime and environment that we built up during that very dangerous, precarious twilight struggle we call the Cold War. The Cold War. We've done it. We did it. My president, George W. Bush, the one appointed me and put me in my position at the State Department, he abrogated the ABM treaty without so much as a fare thee well to the Russians. My boss, Colin Powell, had to get on a plane and rush off. I've got to do something here. I can't believe the president did this. Abrogated that treaty with no other reason than his Secretary of Defense and his Vice President wanted to build ballistic missile defense, which came to be a real threat to Putin when we started talking about essentially putting it in Ukraine when it became a member of NATO, or maybe even before that. So Putin had ample reason to do what he did in Ukraine. I'm not condoning it, but he had ample reason to do it. We didn't have any reason to invade Iraq in 2003, but we did it. So if anyone should be excoriated for an aggressive war that didn't need to be, it should be the United States. We're the biggest hypocrites in the world. Back to the point, though, this dangerous situation where the American people, and I do suspect the Russian people too, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect they've lost a lot of this Cold War angst and fear too, because generations have replaced generations. There's no fear in the land about nuclear war. There's no treaties. So everyone's fat, dumb, and happy. In America, we have no skin in the game whatsoever. Less than 1% of Americans serve in the military and have their lives threatened and go in harm's way. 99% are fat, dumb, and happy and love it that way. Love it that way, which is despicable in a democracy. Think of Rome, who turned its entire security over right before the end to foreigners. No Roman citizen wanted to serve in the legions, so they had to turn their security over to foreigners. That's what we're winding up doing. We're turning it over to the poorest people in the land in an all-volunteer force that can't even recruit now. They've been short for 2 years in a row. We can't sail ships. We can't man battalions. We can't do almost anything with our Army Reserve because they're so short people. So this is just a preposterous situation. And I say all that latter because guess who's going to be the first to use nuclear weapons in this treatyless, forgotten them environment? America. We're going to be the first ones because we're going to get in a real peer power war, whether it's with Moscow over the circumstances you just described, or it's with Beijing over Taiwan or the South China Sea or whatever. Won't make any difference. We're going to lose in the opening shots. And the American people are going to be so shocked. They have never in their life seen, think about this, in their life, even if they're 50, 60 years old, they have never seen the casualties that are going to come in the first 24 to 36 hours and then every day thereafter if we get in a pure power conflict. They've never seen it. More, they have never, you say World War II, Korea. Well, that was over there. That was over there. Maybe the list came to the New York Times, but this is going to be wholesale and within 24 to 36 hours and repetitive over the first 6 or 7 weeks until there's nothing left. Guess who's going to go nuclear in those circumstances? We'll have two choices. We will surrender, and I don't think any White House is going to do that. I do think the majority of the American people would probably be for a surrender, but I don't think the White House is going to go for that. Any party, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, in possession of power in this country today, in this empire today, is never going to let the empire succumb. So we're going to go nuclear. That's our trump card. We will be the first users of nuclear weapons if we allow this situation that exists right now to go on. So I'm as scared about us doing that in a pure power conflict that goes very badly for us in the opening 30 days, which any pure power conflict will, given the state of our armed forces. And I'm also frightened about what might happen in Ukraine because it could be the linchpin of the wooden-headed thinking, if you will, that would lead to an exchange. Because again, if Putin just demonstrates, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to demonstrate too. Where are we going to demonstrate? We're going to demonstrate in the air and burst the last or break the last treaty. As I understand it, Putin has said he doesn't believe in the CTBT anymore anyway, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So you're right. Both scenarios, we walk ourselves stupidly into a pure power war, either with Moscow and China or China and Moscow, because let's face it, we go to Moscow, China's going to be on their side. We go to China, Moscow's going to be on their side. we either walk into that one and have to use it first to prevent a colossal defeat, or we walk into it in Ukraine through just blind stupidity. So it's a very dangerous moment for the world. There are, and we've forgotten this, we have totally forgotten this. I went through it when we were destroying Russian warheads so fast that the lawyers got involved with liability issues and stopped us from doing it. At the end of the Cold War, we were destroying 30,000 warheads in the Soviet Union. And we got down to 4, 5, 6,000 maybe before we were stopped and before everything went to hell and we couldn't do it anymore. And we did the same thing with our own. So we went from 30 on both, roughly 30,000 on both sides, down to around 5 to 6 on both sides, which is a monumental achievement, but not enough. Now, let me give you my point. There's enough megatonnage on our submarines and on Russian submarines alone. Either side fires all of them or most of them to destroy the world. Destroy the world. There'd be no planet left that humans could live on. There's some question about whether the planet itself would survive, but I think it would. But human life would not survive. We don't need the climate crisis. We don't need climate change. We would destroy the world. That's just on the submarines. How many Americans know that? You go into the street, you couldn't find a one who could tell you that. Not a one. And then what would they say if you told them? First of all, they wouldn't believe you. They'd think you were a member of the Trump cult or some other crazy group. And even if they did believe you, it would be hard for them to even conjure what that means. And yet, these ballistic missile submarines carry death for the world.
Yeah, and it might be good to talk more about China. I've been very interested in speaking to you about China ever since you spoke to the Ron Paul Institute and talked about the real reasons why the U.S. was occupying Afghanistan and how it did have a link to China, both with the Xinjiang region, supporting Uyghur separatists to destabilize that part of China, which borders Afghanistan all the way to Pakistan, and destabilizing China trade relations in the region, in that country, and of course the nuclear arsenal in Pakistan. But there is this question of Taiwan as well, which you have referenced many times. And at the Shangri-La dialogue, China's new defense minister, Dang Jun, said that the separatists in Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, the new president representing them, has recently called Taiwan a nation in his inauguration speech. But the defense minister of China said that these separatists will be nailed to the pillar of shame in history, and that the Chinese People's Liberation Army has been an indestructible and powerful force in defense of unification, and it will act resolutely and forcefully at all times to curb the independence of Taiwan and ensure it never succeeds in its attempts. So, Colonel Wilkerson, maybe you can talk about this front of war here that's building Taiwan, because I've covered many times, the U.S. sending special forces to islands just off of the mainland coast, the backlog of weapons. There's so much to talk about here, but perhaps you can go here where you want with it. I know that you have also wargamed the scenario over this, and so I'm very interested in hearing how you think this would go for the United States, given the correlation of forces that you often reference.
Going back to some of the war games, increasingly is, I think, difficult to make applicable because things have changed so much. The general strategic tenor has not changed, though, except, again, we have a Biden mistake, a huge mistake, declaring, as I think he actually used the term, strategic clarity rather than strategic ambiguity. The latter being, of course, what we've been dealing with very successfully, both Beijing and Moscow, or Beijing and Washington, since Nixon and Kissinger met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The strategic ambiguity being, we recognize there's only one China, and China says, okay, thank you very much, and we promise not to use force on Taiwan. There's more to it than that, of course, but that's the gist of it. And then we passed the Taiwan Relations Act because the Republicans, largely neoconservative birthplace or part of it, decided that they didn't like what Nixon and Kissinger did. They didn't like Kissinger in particular. And so, we got a Taiwan Relations Act that said, okay, we recognize that that's what has been achieved in dialogue, and that agreement we will adhere to, but boy, we're going to keep Taiwan ready. We're going to keep their airplanes up. We're going to keep their cannons up. We're going to keep their tanks up. We're going to make sure they're ready. Well, you could make sure they were ready all day long. It wouldn't make much difference. And one of the realities that has not changed, it's just grown dramatically worse, is that in Fujian province alone, the Chinese have enough armament, including ground forces, to swamp Taiwan in about 36 to 48 hours. I don't think the Chinese are going to do that. I hope they're not going to do that because Xi has been very careful in his words. I think he's deploying these military officers and sometimes Wang Yi, whom I feel like I know fairly well. Richard Haas and I met with him in the summer of 2000 in Beijing. He was then, summer of 2001, he was then head of sort of the North American division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we remarked when we finished the lunch with him the second day, I believe it was, we'd been meeting with Shui Tin-kai and then Wang Yi. We remarked out in the hallway, all of us on the policy planning staff of the State Department who were visiting remarked, that's a man to watch. And of course, what Wang Yi has done is what a few in the past, like Chen Chi-chen, have done. He's so competent, he's so good as a diplomat and as a bureaucratic entrepreneur, if you will, that they moved him to being a sort of plenipotentiary between the MOFA and the Politburo. The Chinese don't really like MOFA much in the sense of things, just like we don't like the State Department very much. These guys and gals deal in diplomacy. We like people who deal with power and bullets and bombs and such. So the Chinese are sort of that way too. But when they do move someone out of MOFA up to that position, and Wang Yi could well be a Politburo member someday if he wants to. I wouldn't put that past the power structure to put him actually on the Politburo. But he's an astute man, so I listen to him. I listen to him whenever he's speaking. And along with Sergei Lavrov, who has now turned into sort of a venomous diplomat. I've never seen Sergei be quite this venomous, but I think he's sort of playing the really bad cop to Putin's somewhat bad cop. And so Putin's offering all these, even in English, when he chooses to speak in English, he's offering these let's get togethers and let's end this thing because we need to do that, but realize that I need to get what I invested in it out of it. And while Sergei is getting increasingly rough in his rhetoric and strong in his rhetoric, and I suspect that that is sort of a good cop, bad cop routine. But Sergei's probably one of the best diplomats in the world. I would put Wang Yi and Sergei up as the two top diplomats on the face of the globe right now. And I'd throw a couple of Indians in there too, and there's a tale. Watch where India goes in all this mess, because right now Modi has pretty much gotten his political dilemma solved, at least temporarily. He's going to have to give a lot of power to the opposition in forming a government, but he's back in charge for at least another term. And India and Turkey are the two countries to watch. I suspect Turkey will leave NATO and unhinge its southern flank overnight because Turkey has the most powerful land army in NATO. Not the US, not Germany, not Britain, certainly not Britain, that poodle dog. Turkey. Turkey has the most powerful land army in NATO. If they exit, not only have they uncovered the southern flank of NATO, a very vulnerable flank, but they have also said to the world, I'm either going neutral or I'm going to join the BRICS. And I would suspect the latter. So there you begin the unraveling of Europe and the transatlantic link and the alliance that I've been talking about is coming all along. Turkey would be justified, I think, in saying to the EU, I've been courting you for years and years, decades I've been courting you, and you have turned me away every time. Now I am turning you away. See what you get from it. And, that's the sort of thing that Erdogan might do, not only to do it from a strategic point of view, which would make sense for Turkey, but also to try and win back some of the political capital that he's lost now, as indicated by the most recent elections. So there's all sorts of potential for things to happen here. But back to the China issue, we have forced, with our stupidity in Ukraine and our doggedness in hanging on to a lost situation, almost a formal alliance to occur between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and China and Russia. So much so that I suspect right now that Xi Jinping is building out his nuclear complex, which he wants to do. Mao didn't have many weapons. Mao didn't think he needed many weapons. And China's had that doctrine for a long time. Now they've changed their mind. They're going to build out. They want to be able to ride out a first strike. They want to be able to retaliate after a first strike. That means they're going to go to 5,000 or 6,000 weapons to be the equivalent stockpile of the United States and Russia. So we forced that. And I think probably Putin may help him do that because Putin and the Japanese have probably the best plutonium stocks in the world. And if he wants to build out really fast, he needs plutonium-based warheads rather than uranium-based warheads. That's another story altogether. But that's how dangerous this is, what we've done. Not only that, China is offering Russia, who has now put an economic minister in its defense agency, to manage its economy, because now they're taking that banging on 8 cylinders economy, which was putting about 5.5 to 6% of its very robust GDP into the war in Ukraine. They're now putting 7 to 8 and planning on possibly more of that GDP percentage into their industrial base for military munitions, airplanes, tanks, and such, in order to take NATO on when the bigger war comes, which they are now preparing to fight. So we've caused all this by our strategic imbecility. And there's an old principle of international relations. Fred Hartman put it at the front of his book, The Relations of Nations. It's called the conservation of enemies. And it's simply stated is no prudent state ever wants more enemies at one time than it can handle. Think about that for a minute. And look at what we're doing in Gaza. 3.6 billion people at last count now think, because of Gaza in their face for the last 2 years, or roughly, and Ukraine and Gaza, Ukraine for a couple of years, Gaza since October the 7th, they now think that the greatest agent for chaos in the world, and thus the greatest threat to their future in the world, is the American empire. Poll after poll is now revealing that, particularly amongst 40-year-olds and younger. Even on the Korean Peninsula, an ally, we have young people who think the United States might be the worst threat that South Korea faces. This is not a way to conduct your affairs in the world if you were supposed to be the, quote, rules-based order, unquote, advocate and the law advocate, the rule of law advocate. We're an agent of chaos, not an agent of order. And that might produce what you were talking about. Long answer, but come back to your question. That might produce an exchange of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that analysis. I did want to close with you because I know you have another engagement on what's happening in West Asia, particular Gaza, and regionally. Now, what many people are talking about is perhaps an imminent threat of direct engagement, or maybe heavier engagement, more broad engagement between Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course southern Lebanon, and at the border of Israel. There have been rockets that have caused pretty massive fires, over 1,000 acres, I believe, just completely up in smoke. The video has been circulating. Israel has been talking for quite some time now of a potential military operation targeting Hezbollah. Of course, this comes as it appears Israel is very much bogged down in Gaza, up and down the Strip. Now, you've been very critical. The U.S. is also talking about sanctions on the ICC, given that there is an arrest warrant for Netanyahu that was agreed upon there, and of course with a few other Hamas leaders included in that declaration. Could you talk about maybe there seems to be many fronts here in this war. On the one hand, there's this humanitarian catastrophe, the genocide, and the public relations that this has engendered, disastrous for the United States and Israel. But then there's also the military side of this that feels also very tenuous, very perilous when it comes to the so-called superiority that Israel, the invincible army of Israel, and of course its U.S. backers. So perhaps we could talk about these things. I'll just pass it to you.
I think one of their objectives for the past 16, 17 years, particularly since Netanyahu has held power, either as finance minister or as prime minister, and Sharon in that interim period and others were pretty much of the same mind. It's just Netanyahu was the one going to jail if he didn't keep it up. And so it motivated him a lot more than the others. They have had this philosophy of killing. Shaul Mofaz, a former head of the IDF and a former Israeli defense minister, said, if your policy is force, you will find you have to routinely kill people. Well, that's been Netanyahu's policy since he engineered the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And I've had people in New York and everywhere else, when I would say that publicly, they say, oh, you can't believe it. Yes, absolutely. There was a video made by Jewish filmmakers that they pulled down as fast as they pulled down Al Jazeera. But it used in about 40 to 60% of its footage, I forget the exact percentage, actual footage, including the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. But the other actual footage that they displayed throughout was Bibi Netanyahu's murderous, hateful political rallies, where the settlers would come and he would stir them up and stir them up and stir them up. And then they show the actual footage of the assassination, where a settler walks right up to Rabin with a pistol, right through his security entourage, and shoots him and kills him. And then, of course, Netanyahu resurrects this settler and makes him a hero. This is Bibi Netanyahu for the past 15 plus years. He's been killing Palestinians as he could get away with it. In such operations in Gaza as that in 2011, I think, I had an IDF student actually in my seminar at George Washington University who told me he left. He left because his orders were kill everything that moves. That's their philosophy. Kill the dogs, the cats, the babies, the women, the children, kill everything that moves, because we have to make a point that if you do anything to us at all, that's what we'll do to you. Well, that phenomenon, that creation of that fear factor has gone now, because everyone's seen the IDF for what it really is. And back up a minute, in military terms, the reason it has been so badly misconstrued in the past few years is because Netanyahu and the leaders of the IDF, and that's the reason you have a lot of people who've left or gone into the reserve component because they don't want to be in the active IDF. It's been a constabulary force. It's been a security force. It's been an occupation force. It's been a force that beats up on women and children and shoots teenagers in the streets. It's been a force that stands at gates that are critical to Palestinian jobs and holds them up for 6 or 7 hours so they miss their job. That's the kind of force it's been. And this kind of force does not fight wars very well because it builds a whole bunch of jerks and cowards. And so what we're seeing, and I agree with some of the things Erdogan and others have said about the IDF, this is not the invincible, indomitable force that everyone's come to expect. Well, of course it's not, because it's been on occupation duty for over 15 years. And you cannot keep up real military skills on occupation duties. What you become is a Schutzstaffel, an SS. You become a Gestapo. You may be effective, but you're effective in some really bloodthirsty sorts of ways. So that's who we're looking at right now in the IDF, with the exception of some of the reservists who've had to be called up to do this. And I'm told that there's some real disturbance, not just breaking the silence type disturbance, but some real disturbance amongst the families of and the reservists, not only for being out there so long and away from their jobs and such, but also because they're having to participate in this. And some of them are still decent soldiers, and they don't think going around blowing the brains out of little babies is the way to be a decent soldier. And on top of all of that, they have no more eliminated Hamas then I have gone in my backyard and eliminated the ants. No way in the world. There's still ants out there. In 10 years from now, there's going to be ants out there. And Hamas is not going away. And now the IDF is getting attrited up north in the rubble that it created in the beginning of this conflict by Hamas, who've evacuated the south and gone to the north and are challenging the IDF up there. And Netanyahu has made a bargain with the devil like so many times in the past. With this ceasefire that Biden was trumping and Sullivan and Biden were trumping and so forth, with this ceasefire, he told them, I'm for it. He told Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others in the right wing of his party he wasn't for it. Now he's hoist upon his own petard. He's holding the fuse burning in his hand. And so he's got to say back to Biden, well, no, you changed it, so I'm not for it. And he's got to say to Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others in the right wing of Likud, he's got to say, see, I really didn't settle for it, because they were threatening to walk out. They were seriously threatening to walk out on him. And that would have brought his coalition down, and he'd probably go to jail. Not that anybody who replaced him would be that much better, but at least he wouldn't be a criminal, hopefully. So what does he do? Long way to get to it. He's kept this in reserve all along. His preference is the United States goes to war against Iran. But he's seen through the assassination of Soleimani, bastardly deed that was, that the United States is not going to war against Iran. So he's tried desperately to get the United States to do his work for him and to take out Iran, at least the nuclear complex. So what's his next best bet? Nasrallah and Hezbollah. And he's been keeping this one on the back burner all along. He's been keeping it hot and keeping it. And now he's got 70,000 Israelis who had to evacuate their homes, who are just chomping at the bit at him, like the ones on the hostages, because they want to go back to their homes. But they can't now. You just pointed out why. And that's his next move, is to get into a real shooting conflict, rockets flying and everything else, with Hezbollah. And the United States have to ride in on the white charger, only it won't be a white charger. It'll be black as the ace of spades, and save it. And the United States will say, well, the focus is off Gaza now. We can do this. Again, just as Ukraine, it's a nightmare. It's a cauchemar, as the French say. It's a nightmare. And we've had a lot to do with that nightmare, because when Ariel Sharon came to the Oval Office in 2004 and asked George Bush what his advice was, Bush looked at him and said, and shocked everybody in the diplomatic community, well, we've tried the roadmap, we tried the Middle East peace plan, we've tried all this garbage for 40 plus years and it hadn't worked. Over to you. So carte blanche, Mr. Prime Minister, you go back to Israel and do whatever you want to do. And that's what they've been doing ever since, with Bibi Netanyahu bringing a new vengeance to it. So we're as complicit in this as anybody else. And we're complicit in Gaza today. We provided the bombs, the bullets, the bayonets, everything that they're using. Another disaster for the United States. Our reputational and humanitarian reputation in the world, our reputational interest in the world, humanitarian, rule of law, and so forth, are all in shatters, all tattered. And, Guantanamo did it, torture did it, state-sponsored torture did it. And now look at what we're doing. We're showing the world whom we support. Baby killers, women killers, village destroyers, city destroyers, hospital destroyers, refugee tent bombers. That's whom we're supporting.
Yeah, and you've been a huge voice coming out of the kind of Washington apparatus, telling telling the truth about these things. And I wanted to ask you then, because given that this is the scenario that Israel wants, right, and it seems like a desperate move to try to pull the United States into a larger regional conflict. But when you look at the regional situation, whether it's the U.S. and, as you call them, their poodle, the U.K., bombing Yemen, trying to handle Ansar Allah, and having no real success there, from what I can gather, given
They're
that
handing us our rear end in the Red Sea.
This blockade gets worse and worse the more that
these about this about a week ago. We actually had a U.S. ship retreat. It actually retreated because it was in such grave danger. That's the first time that's happened in a long, long time.
And it's nothing again. Definitely cannot underestimate the kind of rigorous fight back of Ansar Allah and what they've been able to do. But Hezbollah is a completely different
Yes.
force in many ways in terms of its capabilities. And given what you said earlier in the program about the appetite of the U.S. People in the United States around wars, I mean, I'm thinking about, you were in Washington during the beginning of these forever wars in the Middle East. This seems like it would be another one, and I just can't imagine the United States getting pulled in, deploying massive amounts of forces, conducting a kind of kinetic conflict on Hezbollah, and it succeeding in any way, and there being an appetite for that. So how does this all end then if Israel is successful in maybe not being victorious, but at least igniting this kind of a larger regional scenario with Hezbollah and the rest of the axis of resistance for that matter?
Yeah, I think that it will be mostly cosmetic. Now, it won't be cosmetic for the people in Lebanon whom the bombs fall upon. But I think what Netanyahu wants is a deflection from the atrocities in Gaza, and he feels like an attack on his northern front, so to speak, and Hezbollah raining down. I'm told they have somewhere between 150 and 175,000 missiles. A good portion of those missiles, Iron Dome won't do a thing. They'll hit Israeli cities and they'll hit Israeli villages and they will kill people. That will be so dramatic that it will take the focus off Gaza. I don't have any expectation that the United States will put land forces in Lebanon to help Israel any more than we did sort of figuratively, although we did lose 242 or 243 Marines and Navy corpsmen in 1982-3 in that misguided invasion of Lebanon of then Defense Minister Sharon. Um, we won't put land forces in there to help Israel. We'll let Israel take care of it with us backing them up thoroughly. We may even have troops on the ground inside Israel, but we won't have any inside Lebanon. And it will do what Netanyahu wants. It'll take the emphasis off. And before the election, it allowed Joe Biden to say, I didn't have any choice. Israel was imperiled. Jerusalem could go away. Tel Aviv could be burned. I didn't have any choice. I had to go do it. And I'm doing it now. So reelect me. So, this could play into both Netanyahu's political needs and Biden's political needs. But it wouldn't be for the United States a major commitment of ground force.
Yes, yes, indeed. And maybe a final comment. I want to redirect back to this Time magazine interview. So here is how Biden is kind of publicly handling this very delicate situation, because this is, as you said, a lot of this has to do with elections. So here's how he asked here's what how he responded to questions about Israel. So they said, so in Israel, obviously a difficult time there. What steps are you prepared to take against Israel now Netanyahu appears to have crossed your red line in Rafah, Mr. President? I'm not going to speak to that right now because you're going to report this before I'm in the process of talking with the Israelis right now. So I'm not going to. And then they ask, what does this mean? If I tell you, you'll write it. It's not time for you to write it. So this is how Biden is handling questions about this. Maybe
In
final
other,
comment on.
yeah, in other words, I don't know what I'm going to say. I got to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it just speaks to this incoherency. So, any final comments on this conflict in particular? Because I know you've been very outspoken, and maybe where you feel like this needs to head. What direction? I know that you've probably been following closely how people have responded to this in particular in the United States and globally.
The most dramatic thing, I think, from a strategic point of view, which I always try to keep my weather eye to, is Mohammed bin Salman and others like Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, essentially hugging and kissing Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and other people in the BRIC complex. And that's not just a message to the United States that we have other possibilities. And so you better do what we want you to do, like give us our nuclear weapons in Saudi Arabia. That's ultimately what Saudi Arabia wants. And the latest IAEA projection on Iran, and I trust these guys on this because they're still there and they've still got some cameras there. And so they say they've got enough fissile material right now for 3 bombs. They could build 3 bombs. By the way, Netanyahu said if they ever get enough for 1, I'm attacking. So Netanyahu's already reneged on his promise, thank God. But that's a dangerous situation. And I think what we need to do, and this will be my final comment, we need to revert to the strategy that we maintained for so many years once we had the Shah on our side. And then when the Shah went away and we made a balance of power more or less between Baghdad and Tehran until we stupidly took that away with our invasion in 2003. And that is an offshore balancing strategy. Don't have any U.S. forces whatsoever, not even a defense attaché, I would say, in my view, on the ground in the Levant, period. It's too dangerous a place. There's a red bullseye target on the back of every single uniformed American. Now, probably 2 red bullseye marks. A friend in Tunisia said to me the other day, Larry, in every souk, in every restaurant, in every street, there are 18 and 19-year-olds talking about attacking the United States. I don't doubt that for a moment. Ali Soufan's group says the number of Al Qaeda recruits right now is booming. ISIS had pulled a lot away from them. Now, Al Qaeda in Yemen, for example, its recruiting is booming. They've got lots of new members. So we need to get out of the Middle East. And we don't need to get out in the sense that, people say, oh, God, you're out of the Middle East. No, we still have maritime forces and we still have ARGs and MEUs, amphibious ready groups and marine expeditionary units in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere. Our real strength is our maritime power. That's our real strength. Well, let's rely on that strength. Plus, it is not a threatening force unless it's flying planes or shooting guns. And so you can keep it offshore. You can keep it in the North Arabian Sea, the Sea of Oman, Indian Ocean. You can keep it in the Mediterranean. And it's a force for order, as we used to say we were, and we were to a certain extent, rather than a force for chaos. So we need to change our entire outlook about the Levant. We won't do that till we get a new president. Not Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. We need a new president, a fresh man, a fresh woman, someone probably under 60, and someone who understands grand strategy. You say, where is that person? I don't know. I don't see one in America. But we desperately need new leadership.
Well, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, thank you so much for joining today. Is there anything that you'd like to share in terms of where people can find you and your work? And I can immediately add it to the video description if if desired.
Shoot, I don't even know these days. I do so many. you know my good friend from Sao Paulo, Brazil, Nima.
Yes, Nima. Yes, you are often on Dialogue Works. That's a great channel. I do recommend everyone follow it.
I didn't realize he was Iranian until a few months ago.
Oh, I didn't know that either. I didn't know that. I thought
we had some good talks about when he left Iran and what he thinks about Iran now and such.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, definitely, that is certainly almost a sister brother channel here. We cover very much the same thing. So certainly follow Dialogue Works. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, thanks so much. I will let you go. I know you have another engagement. Take good care, and hopefully we'll be in touch very soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oops. All right. Okay. We are in business. We will do a story or two. Let's see how things go after the first story. All right. How about that? And we will see how we are doing. That was a great interview from Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is someone I've been following for quite some time. I'm so glad I was able to finally get him on the program. We have some good stories coming up, so stick around. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notifications bell. I want to cover a few things. Okay, perhaps a Ukraine, perhaps a Taiwan story. Let's see where we are with this. Okay. Okay, let me just get some things up here. Okay. Let's do it. Let us do it. Let me actually do Taiwan first. How about that? Because this is not spoken about too often in a sophisticated way. So let us get started there. All right. Here we go. Interesting. So let's I'll take some questions at the end, okay? Super chats are best for questions, but I'll also try to engage with the chat toward the end here. Okay. Here we go. The United States' provocation of China with regard to Taiwan continues unabated. And this is a subject, this is a flashpoint that isn't getting the attention it deserves right now. But certainly, as the United States is bogged down in the Middle East and West Asia with regard to Gaza and the rest of the axis of resistance, as Israel continues its onslaught with regard to Ukraine and the overall NATO proxy war with Russia, the United States may appear to be bogged down, but nonetheless has consistently made Taiwan and the Pacific theater its most primary and important theater of its military apparatus. So this has been made indelibly clear when we look at what was a completely disastrous interview that Joe Biden gave for Time magazine. And here's the full transcript. We're just going to go right down to Taiwan. Okay. And I want to first, this is the first question they asked. Pretty much everyone agrees managing the rise of China is the most important foreign policy and national security issue for America and Americans in the coming century. And mind you, when they were talking about Taiwan, when they're talking about foreign policy in Time magazine, they are speaking strictly from a neocon foreign policy perspective. You know, if you get a chance to read the full interview, do, because you get the sense that Time magazine is also pushing a foreign policy agenda, and it's pushing the neocon foreign policy agenda. The CIA director, Bill Burns, the interviewer says, has made President Xi Jinping of China a concern because he's ordered the Chinese military to be ready by 2027 to conduct a successful invasion of Taiwan. You said on multiple occasions that you would use force to defend Taiwan. What does that mean? Is it boots on the ground? What shape would it take? Biden says it would depend on circumstances. You know, by the way, I've made clear to Xi Jinping that what we agree with. We signed onto previous presidents going way back to the policy of that if we are not seeking independence, because we are not seeking independence for Taiwan, nor will we, in fact, not defend Taiwan if so it says, let me read this again because Joe Biden was quite incoherent during this interview. He said, so intervening in Taiwan depends on the circumstances. He's made clear with Xi Jinping that we signed on to previous presidents going way back to the policy of that we are not seeking independence for Taiwan, nor will we, in fact, not defend Taiwan if China unilaterally tries to change the status. And so we're continuing to supply capacity, and we've been in consultation with our allies in the region. So this is how Joe Biden answered. Then the next question was, if I might, not ruling out the possibility of deploying U.S. troops in the case of an invasion. Biden said, not ruling out using military force. There's a distinction between deploying on the ground, air power, and naval power. So maybe you're striking from bases in Philippines or Japan. Is that? And then Biden interrupts saying, I'm not going to get into it. You would then criticize me with good reason if I were to tell you. So that is how Joe Biden responded to questions, obviously making clear that the U.S., even if he is not so clear, making clear that the United States does look at war with China as a very near possibility, and that it is using the justification for its escalations around the fear of a future war that China starts, right? This always goes back to China, but nonetheless, to predict for some kind of future fear, some kind of future cataclysmic event, even if it were 100% true, means that you are still escalating and you are still being the aggressor, in that China has been very clear that it has taken the most decisive action around Taiwan only when the United States has sent delegations to Taiwan, congressional delegations, political delegations, that it has marked out pretty clear red lines on this issue, and that otherwise it has simply been conducting what is in its right: exercises, drills, preparations along its territorial waters, which, mind you, Taiwan is incredibly close to China. Some of its so-called islands under its authority are just a stone's throw away. So we have to always remember this. But yet here is the United States giving Taiwan an F-16 boost. So the latest arms sale was approved of $300 million in parts to Taiwan's F-16 fighter jets, as the self-ruled island, they call it, strengthens its military with an eye on China. The sales serves U.S. interests by, quote unquote, supporting the recipient's continuing efforts to modernize its armed forces and to maintain a credible defensive capability. And this is according to a statement by the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency. The DSCA said it had notified Congress, which typically approves arms sales to Taiwan. U.S.-made F-16s form the core of Taiwan's air power. In December of 2023, the U.S. Air Force concluded a $4.5 billion Phoenix Peace Rising program to upgrade all 139 of Taiwan's F-16s into the modern Viper variant. Taiwan is still waiting for the additional 66 F-16V Block 70 fighters that Congress approved for sale in 2019. These have been met with delays and are now expected to be delivered in Taipei in batches over the next 2 years. And we're going to get into these delays very soon. So, per the request of Taiwan's de facto embassy in the U.S., de facto embassy, this is how they talk about it. De facto embassy. It's not a de facto embassy. That is a critical indication that the United States is very interested in separatism. All it is an American-funded institution that acts as an embassy, which is very much crossing China's red line. But nonetheless, the State Department has approved an estimated $220 million of standard and $80 million of non-standard spare and repair parts, as well as related supplies and technical and logistic support, according to the DSCA on Wednesday. If greenlit by Congress, the package will improve Taipei's ability to meet current and future threats, quote, by increasing the operational readiness of Taiwan's F-16, end quote. Taiwan's so-called foreign ministry on Thursday thanked the U.S. for its continued implementation of security commitments to Taiwan, pointing out that it's the 14th arms sales to be approved by the Biden administration. But I want to show you how absolutely egregious and ridiculous all of this really is. Because as we are talking about so-called arms sales to Taiwan, as we are talking about militarizing Taiwan for the purpose of war with China, there is something very important to note about this. And I want to be very, very clear about what this is really all about. Because as we have seen with Ukraine, there is absolutely no concern about the Ukrainian people, about the future of Ukraine, about its stability, about its economy, about peace, because the United States has been thwarting all of that, has been decimating all of that from the very beginning of the conflict. Ukraine had a way out. It had a peace agreement. It was signing it in April of 2022. And what did the United States do? The United States pushed and prodded and ultimately, I believe, had its own forces essentially allowing Ukraine to rebuke it. And of course, the war has continued on to this day. Now, Taiwan is no different. The United States doesn't care about the people in Taiwan. It doesn't care about quote unquote democracy. And what conflict has it really ever cared about such a thing? Taiwan, of course, is important for many reasons. Its semiconductor chip industry has become the target of U.S. machinations attempting to really outsource that industry to the United States as a way to try to outcompete China. A fantasy, but nonetheless, it's important. And of course, it is, as it long has been for the last several decades, dating back to the 1950s, the United States sees Taiwan as an important base hub, an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the region from which it can strategically make aggressive moves toward China, war maneuvers toward China. And of course, there are other considerations as well, including the fact that the United States wants to undermine China at the diplomatic level, weaken China's influence worldwide. And what better way to do that than to cause a kind of rift and division around standard agreements on who and what is the rightful leader of China, the People's Republic of China, at the United Nations. That is what Taiwan represents, the possibility to undermine Beijing politically. So there are many fronts of this war, but it is also important to note that Taiwan is also, simply put, a very convenient strategic location from which arms dealers, weapons manufacturers, and war profiteers can boost their own profits. Because while Michael McCall has made very interesting comments saying that what Taiwan will receive, recently he said these words in the month of May. He said Taiwan's weapons are going to be new. They're going to be ready to use, unlike those in Ukraine. A pretty stark admission that the Ukraine conflict is fraudulent. But let's be clear here. This whole model of war profiteering is not at all about military readiness. It is about making enormous amounts of profits. And what does this have to do with Taiwan? Well, those delays that you just heard are actually part of a long-standing backlog. Here is the Cato Institute, of course, a right-wing think tank connected to the U.S. government. But the Cato Institute says does Taiwan arms backlogs, and as of May 2024, we can just look at this very clearly. This backlog is almost 20 billion US dollars for such a small island. Arms sales backlogs by weapons categories: you have munitions at 2.66 billion, asymmetric warfare technology at 6.16, and the traditional military armaments at 10.87 billion. And then you can see the list, okay, and look at this versus May versus April, okay. You have now 19.69 billion being the difference. And then you can see the categories. Here is the F-16C Block 70 backlog that they were just mentioning with regard to the F-16s. So this is just an indication, right? In millions of dollars, you have here, right? So many millions of dollars in this technology, completely backlogged, not at all, not only not usable. This isn't even technology that can be used, weapons that can be used. It hasn't even gotten there yet. It is not deployed. That's the delays that they are talking about, okay? So when it comes to these arms sales, let us be very clear here that this is not a war that the United States is necessarily ready for. How long did it take for China to institute military drills that comprise of its entire military apparatus, from the Navy to the Air Force to its ground forces? How long did that take for China to do after Lai Ching-te, the new so-called president of Taiwan, gave a speech on May 20th stating that Taiwan was a nation? Immediately, the People's Liberation Army went into full force and conducted 2 days of drills, of military drills surrounding the island, blockading the island, or at least mimicking that for the time when it is actually needed to be conducted. So China is prepared for this conflict. Taiwan is simply being used as a prominent and important, but nonetheless a staging ground for war profiteering. This is a lot of what this has to do with. These weapons manufacturers are driving U.S. foreign policy and making it so that if anyone looks clearly at U.S. foreign policy with regard to China, you can see that the profits of weapons manufacturers, the profits of war profiteering, all take a pretty commanding place in why China is seen as this so-called threat. The bigger the threat, the more opportunities to invest in military armaments. And as we've seen in Ukraine, when you have backlogs such as these, when you have a production model such as this, dependent upon not long-term strategic use, but dependent upon short-term political and economic gain, well, then you have essentially already a failed strategy that will lead to disaster. And that is why so many believe that this would end rather than a kinetic military conflict between the United States lasting any significant period of time. They would immediately go nuclear because, one, Taiwan never had a chance. Let's be honest. It's a small island. It is historically Chinese. The one China principle is still very much in effect. The status quo, even though there's been independence sentiment that has been spurned and supported and that has been coddled by the United States and its proxies there. Nonetheless, the status quo is still very popular, meaning that most people don't want to see full independence because they don't want to see the war that would engender. So, all of this is to say is that the U.S. strategy here is a complete failure, but nonetheless, it is happening. And it is something that we need to be very much aware of because at any moment, this could kick off similar to how the Ukraine conflict was sparked. And this is back in February of 2024, something we've covered here, but always we need reminding that it isn't simply weapons, right? It isn't just this relationship with Taiwan, regardless of whether it's war profiteering or actually getting ready for a geopolitical cataclysmic conflict with China. Those two aims, the military and the economic, those aren't simply characterized by just handing weapons over or the lack thereof to Taiwan's so-called military authorities. Actually, there are U.S. special forces on the ground in Taiwan training troops near China's coasts. And the United Daily News of Taiwan reported that the training regiments, that there's a permanent arrangement of training regiments that, rather on a rotational basis, are including permanent forces on an island just 6 miles away from the Chinese coast. So, these training regiments were planned and supervised by the 1st Special Forces Group, an airborne unit under the provision of last year's National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed in December 2022. Okay, so that's what's happening. The U.S. service members, are training Taiwan's armed forces became clear in an open secret that was officially not officially acknowledged until 2021 during Tsai Ing-wen's tenure, where she said a few American instructors on the island were there for occasional training programs within the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, however, opened the door to more robust cooperation between two security partners. Taiwan's defense ministry did not comment on this report, but said all foreign exchanges are conducted according to an annual plan. And the U.S. Defense Department spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Mayers, had no comment for specific training, but said, quote, "I would highlight that our support and defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China." So just some clarity on how close this really is to the mainland if we can just zoom out. Okay, so here is the mainland of China. This is Fujian province. Fujian province is the closest province to Taiwan. And here are the Kinmen Islands. Do you see? 6 nautical miles from China's coast. And in those 6 nautical miles, you can see that it's not just Kinmen, but there's Xiamen right there. Okay, very close. And then here's Penghu Island. So those are the two places where these exercises are occurring. And then the Daily News newspaper said Army Green Berets of the 1st Special Battalion Forces Group are this year permanently stationed at 2 bases of the 101st Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion. The instructors were sent to the Penghu Islands near Taiwan, but also to Kinmen, a group of islands visible to the port city of Xiamen in eastern China on the Chinese side of Taiwan Strait. So that means Chinese people on the mainland can literally look out and see this island, and that is where these forces are training. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous. This is incredibly indicative of where things are going. Okay, so we start here with reckless comments. We started here with reckless comments by the Biden administration, by Joe Biden himself, talking about how U.S. troops will not be ruled out in a potential scenario where China invades Taiwan. And then we go to arms sales that are already happening, which are supposedly to prepare Taiwan for that invasion, to defend itself. Mind you, we've had Chinese official after Chinese official, most recently Dong Jun, the new defense minister, say very clearly that the goal is reunification, but that military means are the last resort. However, that military means would be used to crush separatists should they be given an opportunity to, to be empowered and then to take the unthinkable move of declaring formal independence in violation of China's sovereignty, in violation of UN Resolution 2758, and in violation of the One China principle that virtually every country has signed on to with China, including the United States. And then you have the reality that actually the United States is not just simply politically supporting these forces, these separatists. It's not just militarily arming these forces in Taiwan, but it's also directly on the ground training separatist forces in Taiwan. So this is what crossing a red line looks like, and it's happening underneath our noses because no one is noticing. These stories come and go. They're small reports. They get overlooked. The conflict in Ukraine is a disaster. The genocide in Gaza is a historic miscalculation and catastrophe for the U.S.'s so-called rules-based order. But make no mistake, when Lloyd Austin said at Shangri-La that the Indo-Pacific Theater, as they're calling it, meaning the Asia-Pacific, is their most important area of strategic and military, in the U.S.'s military and strategic initiative. Its overall strategy is dependent on this. We should not ignore that. There's debates. I hear them. I get asked them all the time. Well, no, Russia's more important. No, actually, the Middle East is now more important. Look at the United States' posture there. And I would really caution anyone who actually believes this, when the fact of the matter is that despite being bogged down, and I believe with no intention of their own, I don't believe the neocons, I don't believe the United States was planning on getting bogged down in Ukraine. I think they underestimated Russia. I really do. I don't believe they thought that Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza would last as long as it has, because I do believe that they overestimated Israel's strength and their own in containing the powder keg and the resistance that exists in that region. All the while, even so, despite these monumental challenges to U.S. primacy, the United States has been building up to war with China over Taiwan. And I want to just show you how the Council on Foreign Relations, a CIA directed and led body, is talking about U.S. strategy. A 3-theater defense strategy, how America can prepare for war in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. You notice which one is first? Asia. And I'm not going to get into the contents of it because it is a very long, winded article that basically makes one clear point, and that is that U.S. strategy, military strategy in a three-front war needs to be conducted with essentially a long litany of so-called allies, basically vassals, that the United States needs to whip its vassals into shape, that the United States cannot win these wars by itself, and that if it has any chance to wrestle hold and control the situations in West Asia, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and in Europe, and of course in the Asia Pacific theater, it's going to have to do so with a very strong, very disciplined, very militarized, and very much subordinate and compliant set of vassals. That is the goal, everybody. That is truly the goal here when it comes to the situation that the United States finds itself in. War is coming here. I hate to say this every single time that I cover China, but I've been to China several times in the last 3 years. I've been there 3 times since 2020. And each and every time I go, every time I witness what's happening there, the first thought I have is the United States will never allow this to exist forever. Meaning, it will never allow what China is doing to occur under its watch without a massive response. And so, as the United States has been building up the foundations for that massive response, for that unthinkable war, a lot of people have had their eyes on other things, and and in many respects, that is to be understood. That is to be expected when the United States is now not only everywhere around the world militarily occupying, destabilizing via maybe covert means, via proxy wars, this kind of thing. But now we have a situation where every hot flashpoint of military interventionism, everywhere where there is out and out warfare occurring, not only is the United States behind it and engineering it and egging it on and facilitating it, but these conflicts themselves have the potential, maybe in ways that we haven't seen in years and years and years since the Cold War, to spark a larger and broader conflict that I think many believed after the fall of the Soviet Union would never be possible again. So we are in a history shaking and earth shattering kind of epical shift here. And that means that something like Taiwan and this US China war developing might get pushed essentially under the priority scale, below the priority scale of many people. And I say that is incorrect. That is a recipe for disaster. We turn a blind eye to this, and one day we might find ourselves very much rapidly in that unthinkable war that we had decided was not as important as those others. The United States isn't thinking like that. NATO isn't thinking like that. The neocons aren't thinking like that. The elites are not thinking like that. They are thinking about the whole of the U.S. full spectrum dominance doctrine, the whole of its strategy for maintaining and expanding U.S. primacy. And that means China, the war on China, as John Pilger so prolifically, and rest in peace and power to that hero of the peace movement, as John Pilger noted in his movie War on China, The Coming War on China. Indeed, this war is not only coming, but it has been built up toward even back in 2016 before the Trump administration massively escalated tensions with China and before the Biden administration took the mantle and actually worsened the situation dramatically. This has been happening for a very long time. It's not something that the forces of war, the neocons, the foreign policy establishment are going to let go of. And that means that not only is war coming, but it is closer than it has ever been. And I think the evidence shows every arms sale, every report on new escalations regarding training and the like, and of course, the political growth of separatism on Taiwan fueled by US policy. All of that signals that we are closer to that unthinkable war than we ever have been. All right, everybody, that is the end of that story. Okay, so I could do one more, or I could take questions. One for a story, two for announcements and questions. How about that? In the chat. In the chat. Let's see. And then I'll take and wherever that goes, one or two. One. One for another story, two for 1/2, two for announcements, and of course some engagement before I head out of here. Okay, I'm seeing some twos, I'm seeing some ones. Wow, it's almost a draw. It's a draw right now. One. All right, looks like one is winning. Let's see. 7 3/8. All right, everybody, you're all right. So we got more ones. All right, let's very quickly though, because I do have to depart. This will be a Ukraine story. Okay, nothing too massive here. So here we go. This won't be long. This will be brief. Russia has responded to NATO's crossing of its red line, in particular with regard to the green lighting of US and NATO weapons being used or to be used on Russian territory. Now, this has come amid reports also that NATO is preparing a plan to deploy hundreds of thousands of US troops quickly to the Russian border to confront Russia should Russia, as they say with China, right? Should Russia invade NATO, well, China, of course, is always told where is going to invade Taiwan. But Putin has responded. Russia has responded. And here is what Putin had to say. Putin outlines Russian response to long-range missile strikes. Moscow is considering arming adversaries of the West in sensitive areas. Russia is considering asymmetric measures against Kiev's sponsors due to Ukraine's use of Western-supplied weapons against its territory, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said. The Russian leader's remarks came at a meeting with the heads of international news agencies on Wednesday on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. We have no illusions in this regard, said Putin, repeating his prior comments that Ukrainian troops might be pulling the trigger, but the U.S. and its allies are providing intelligence and targeting information. Russia will respond by boosting air defenses and destroying these missiles, Putin said. Secondly, if someone deems it is possible to supply such weapons to the war zone to strike our territory, why shouldn't we supply similar weapons to those regions of the world where they will be used against sensitive sites of these countries, the Russian president added. We can respond asymmetrically. We will give it a thought. All right. So he said also, we will completely destroy international relations, or it will completely destroy international relations and undermine international security. That is what Putin said. If we see that these countries are being drawn into a war against us, and this is their direct participation in the war against Russia, then we reserve to act in a similar way. This is a recipe for serious problems. So Vladimir Putin has basically said, he's laying down the gauntlet, that not only, and I believe he's saying two things here. He's saying, one, asymmetric responses. Wherever these weapons are being supplied, wherever there's training, wherever that is happening, why can't Russia sponsor and arm forces that are against that? Why can't they use their military arsenal to sponsor forces that will make it very difficult for these NATO countries to operate, to conduct, to allow for these forces and these weapons to be used at all? And then I think he's also saying that should it escalate to this degree, should it escalate to the degree where there are these weapons in a long range manner hitting Russian military assets and Russian territory, and I believe he's talking about deeper than just Belgorod and right above that Kharkov border line. I believe he's talking about far more than that, that he's talking about that this could be missile strikes all across Russian territory, as long-range missiles have certain capabilities, ATACMS, etc. So I believe he's also saying that this could lead to Russia hitting those NATO countries. Should that happen? That's the problems that he is citing, because that is ultimately what the laws of war would dictate. That would be a very measured and reasonable response, except it would mean doomsday. It would mean the doomsday scenario, that second to midnight doomsday clock that we are really on the cusp of, would strike midnight, and we would have a nuclear proliferation scenario, a nuclear conflict very much and rapidly occurring. Now, I want to show you now, okay, what Putin had to say about plans to attack NATO, because a lot of this has to do with the idea that Russia's not going to stop at Ukraine. We have to bring the war to Russia, because not only is Ukraine bogged down, not only is Ukraine in big trouble, but we have to bring the war to Russia to stop it from invading NATO in the future. That's what these plans, these corridors are supposedly about. In real time, and in the real world, what we're actually talking about is NATO preparing for war with Russia. This is just a propaganda smokescreen to say, well, Russia wants to invade NATO. Why? Because Russia continuously says and never acts in a manner. So it's not just about what Putin says here, which is important, but also Russia never acts in a manner that could make you think that it's going to invade NATO. Even if you took the assumption that Ukraine was invaded by Russia, which many have argued that actually it has been intervening on behalf of the Donbass and Russian speakers and Russian people in eastern Ukraine during a really brutal military campaign led by NATO and its proxy government of Ukraine since 2014, the coup government. That ever since then, Russia has seen it as a necessity to protect these people who have such a deep relationship to Russia. Well, if you subscribe to the other narrative, the Western narrative that Russia invaded Ukraine, well, Ukraine's not a NATO member. So you can't say that that behavior has anything to do with a bigger plan to invade NATO. But nonetheless, here's what Putin had to say. It's bull, Putin, on plans to attack NATO. The idea that Moscow has some kind of plan to attack NATO is a stupid attempt to maintain West's global hegemony by fear. Putin was asked about NATO's preparations to defend from a Russian invasion at a meeting with the head of international news agencies, again at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Look, someone has imagined that Russia wants to attack NATO. Have you gone completely insane? Are you as thick as two short planks? Who came up with this nonsense? This bull. The Russian president suggested that this bull was in service of deceiving Western public, urging them to send more weapons to Ukraine. Why is this being done? Really, to maintain their own positions of greatness. That's why there's nothing to these scare stories intended for the townsfolk in Germany and France and elsewhere in Europe. In Ukraine, we're just protecting ourselves. Don't make up things and then form opinions about Russia on the basis of them. You only hurt yourself in that way. So that was what Vladimir Putin had to say to this. Now, I want to show you how a friend of the show, Scott Ritter, reacted to this on Judge Napolitano's show. But first, before I do that, okay, I will show you how Colonel Douglas McGregor reported this development on corridors, okay, from the Telegraph. It says NATO is now planning to get U.S. troops to the front line to fight Russia. What are they thinking? NATO has disclosed its preparations to deploy American troops to the European front lines in the event of a full-scale conflict with Russia. Innovative land corridors are being established to expedite movement of soldiers through Central Europe, bypassing bureaucratic hurdles. This strategic setup enables NATO forces to swiftly react should Putin's aggressive actions in Ukraine extend westward. Reports suggest that these plans also encompass provisions for potential Russian attacks. In such scenarios, troops could mobilize through corridors in Italy, Greece, and Turkey to reach the Balkans, or alternatively advance towards Russia's northern border via Scandinavia. And here's the map that was shared, okay, at how this would occur. U.S. forces airlifted into NATO countries, then taking these corridors straight through bureaucratic hurdles. And now look at Turkey. I do believe that if Turkey were to be involved in this way, that we would see, I believe we would see the end of Turkey's membership into NATO, because I think popular pressure would not allow this. This is an absolutely insane plan to try to mobilize a coherent NATO strategy for war with Russia. And they always say in the event of a potential invasion, but guess what? There is no potential invasion of NATO. Russia has absolutely no interest. What would compel Russia? And I'm going to play how Scott Ritter responded to all of this. What would compel Russia to do this? Absolutely nothing. This is complete fantasy. This is NATO gone wild. You might have remembered those commercials, those really horrific exploitative commercials of young girls, right, taken on video as they were partying or whatnot, and then it was distributed to the public. Well, this is NATO's version of this. They have gone wild. They are publicly announcing all of these ridiculous plans, these horrific plans that would lead to World War III, and all of them essentially amount to desperation. One, that if Russia's actions are taken into consideration, there's absolutely no basis for this. But we will talk about what the real basis for this is after we hear Scott Ritter. So here we go.
Sullivan, Austin, etc., President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, understand the gravity of this moment as you've explained it? Or are they just propagandists?
You know, I used to have a friend named William Polk, and I say used to because tragically he passed away a couple of years ago. But William Polk was a man who was in the inner circle for John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he talks about, and he's talked to me many times about the decision-making that was going on and the role that Kennedy played in preventing a nuclear war, the maturity Kennedy had as a leader. Part of that maturity came from when Kennedy was first briefed on what was then called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the SIOP, the American War Plan. He went to the Pentagon and they briefed him. They said, this is, if we go to nuclear war, this is what we got. And basically, it was premised on the notion that America will be the largest surviving civilization, but in order to guarantee that, we have to kill everybody in the world. And he came out and said, that's insane. I'm not doing that. And he turned to his advisor and said, and we call ourselves the human race. And he said, you have to give me options. Every president since then, or up until George W. Bush, reacted the same way. When they first got that briefing on how America plans to go to war, which is to destroy the entire world so that when the 20 to 30% of America that survives will be the largest remaining civilization cluster in the world, guaranteeing American global dominance in a post-nuclear conflict, insanity. They all said the same thing, insane, give me options. I can't go to that. You can't make me do this. You have to give me options. And the Pentagon always gave them options that inevitably led to that. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans have downplayed their nuclear war plan. We detargeted our missiles. Nothing was automatic anymore. We were heading in a path of, getting rid of nuclear weapons. And then George W. Bush came in a post 9/11 environment and said, we will use our nuclear weapons to ensure that a 9/11 never happens again. And we reinserted nuclear war planning into our military doctrine. And today we have that same mindset, that same nuclear war strategy without the maturity of John F. Kennedy. We have people who look at the plan and say, well, that's just a plan. We're not really going to do that. and they say the Russians are bluffing. We don't have to worry about this. The problem is the second something happens and that plan is pulled out, the dust is blushed off, and we start pushing buttons, we go to the scenario that John F. Kennedy said was insanity. Judge, we're going to blow up the entire world because we know that in a post-nuclear environment, we can't allow, for instance, India to survive intact because we're going to be reduced to 30% of our capacity. We can't allow India to have a superior civilization in a post-nuclear conflict. We're going to destroy the entire world. That's what the American nuclear war plan is. And the American people need to wake up and understand it's on full automatic. Full automatic.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is ultimately what this is leading to when NATO announces these plans, when there is this talk, these leaks that come out about NATO and what it is planning to do around a kinetic war, a direct confrontation with Russia. What that leads to is the nuclear scenario, and what it leads to is exactly what was delineated there. It leads to a cascading of events, of moves, which are why we have this doomsday clock that says seconds to midnight, and why U.S. wars put us into that just unthinkable red zone. So that is ultimately where things are going, and and I think Scott is exactly right. It is all about bluster from the U.S. side, believing that Russia is bluffing and believing that it has the ability to confidently walk around with this insane policy of aggression with Russia because it believes that it is Russia that will be restrained. Well, Russia has every right to defend itself. If it believes it is under the threat of nuclear war, it will deploy its own. It will defend itself. We are seeing that Russia is showing us. I've covered it on this channel, not just with tactical nuclear weapons drills, but also with the potential launch of a strategic nuclear weapon on a testing site to show NATO and show the world that these weapons exist in Russia's arsenal. All of that are messages to say that Russia is not bluffing. But the thing is that Russia has only one goal here, and this is what the big problem is, because Russia's goal is to defend itself. China's goal, Scott mentioned India there, China would face the same fate if there was a nuclear conflict precipitated by NATO against Russia. Then, of course, China would also find itself under the gun because under this doctrine, China would not be allowed to exist in a post-nuclear war with better capabilities than the United States at that level. So all this is to say is that, of course, the whole world is at risk. But the fact of the matter is that the United States is really playing with fire. Right? You have Russia, who has said it is not bluffing, and it said it's not bluffing under the auspices and context of a policy of defense, of self-defense, of national, so-called national security, as we often call it. But really what we're talking about is defense of sovereignty. That's how Russia is operating. This is the big problem here, is that the United States and NATO are viewing Russia from the view that it is an offensive force, that it is taking a posture antithetical and in conflict with the United States. And that is not just because of Russia's military capabilities, its might, and its threat to U.S. primacy, which, mind you, is ridiculous given the fact that Russia does not expand beyond its own borders. You heard what Putin said about NATO. Where does Russia have military installations along the NATO sphere? Nowhere. It wasn't until 2022 where Russia took decisive action in special military operation to defend the forces with relationships to Russia along its own border against Ukraine and NATO-sponsored genocide of the people of the Donbass. It wasn't until 2022 when that happened. It wasn't until 2015 when Russia gave support to Syria to fight the U.S.-backed, Israeli-backed, Saudi-backed, etc., proxies, ISIS, etc. to in Syria. It wasn't until 2015, but Syria isn't a NATO country. Syria gave Russia permission. Where in the NATO sphere has Russia extended its tentacles? It doesn't exist. Russia has built economic relations, trade relations, certainly defense relations in some regard with Turkey, etc. But can you say that this is equivalent to attempting to expand, to create its own kind of a NATO-like treaty organization, a military organization led by Russia? No. Russia and China, they want increased integration, but they are not stomping on the world to get it. They are not putting countries under their thumbs to get that integration, to get that cooperation, to get those relations. It's a different form of working with others. It's multilateralism, it's multipolarity, it is coexisting, it is developing a world where prosperity, where trade, where development and infrastructure and the overall sovereignty of all countries is respected. That is the big problem here. That is the problem that Russia represents. This is why there is this conflict. This is why there are these plans. It has nothing to do whatsoever with any kind of expansive doctrine from Russia. So we're seeing the development of something very, very dangerous. We are seeing that this conflict in Ukraine is turning into something much bigger. And it always was going to turn into this because it always had an element of major power confrontation, of this imperial order, this world order that is declining. It's in massive decline. It is turning into its opposite, this force for just dominance is now becoming a shell of itself because its control and grip over the political and economic trajectory of the world is waning. The US economy is shrinking. NATO's economies, look at the European economies, look at the EU. It's essentially its brother and sister project, the EU. It is in shambles. It has leveled all these sanctions on Russia only to find that it has stagnated its own growth. Okay, so this is really the end of an epic, the epic of, or I should say epoch, if I'm to be less American about it, but the epoch that we have been all living under of Pax Americana, of U.S. hegemony, of the project for a new American century, of American exceptionalism, all of this is going away. The empire is falling, it is crumbling, it is declining. It, in just the next several decades, will not be able to maintain its economic primacy, and its military primacy is fast becoming all that it has left. And even there, it is finding that it doesn't matter. And this is what so many over the years, okay, have said, that it does, that all the technology in the world, all of the most dangerous weapons, all of the arms, all of the guns, they cannot suppress, they cannot destroy the ideas of people and the overall development of a more free, of a more liberated, of a more self-determined planet. And now we are finding that even those guns, those arms, that superior military capacity the United States has long championed is just not so superior after all. I mean, Afghanistan kicked the United States out quite rapidly, quite quickly in just a few decades. And when it did happen, it happened with extreme rapidity. We're talking about a massive embarrassment for the US empire. So all this is to say is that Putin is not bluffing. Russia is not bluffing, but Russia is not going to blow up the world. Russia is not going to be the party responsible for that. But the second that the United States, that NATO indicates that this conflict is on that there is going to be a nuclear option on the table, that there is a move to directly intervene into Russia's affairs, onto Russian territory. When the United States and NATO present that scenario, you better believe Russia will respond. If the special military operation hasn't taught us anything, it's that no, Russia's not bluffing. Russia's willing to go as long as it takes to ensure, and as hard as it takes to ensure, that its sovereignty is respected. It just so happens to be in an almost checkmate position because Ukraine is essentially defeated and NATO is now scrambling for the next strategy, not the exit strategy, but the next strategy to contain and thwart Russia. Well, the big news here is that it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. And that is why we need to buckle up, because these doomsday scenarios are all made possible by the US's impudence, by the US empire's impotence, by its decline, its weakness. And in many ways, that is a good thing because a new world is in birth. But in many ways, it signals dangers that we cannot ignore. And this one, with regard to NATO and Russia, is perhaps the most important one in front of our eyes right now. All right, everybody, that's the end of the stories. Okay, I'm going to do quick announcements and then I got to head out of here. So tomorrow, Mark Sloboda. All right, I actually need to get that going. 1 p.m. Eastern time, I have planned with Mark Sloboda. 1 p.m. Eastern time, Mark Sloboda will be with me. Do save that date, June 7th. And then Monday, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, Scott Ritter will be joining the show for his direct words of response to what happened to him, as well as we're going to go over Ukraine and all the various things going on in the world, Israel, etc. And then on Tuesday morning, I believe I have Pepe Escobar coming on after his trip to Moscow that he was able to go to because he wasn't traveling from the United States and he wasn't named Scott Ritter. So we will be talking about a lot with St. Petersburg, etc., with regard to Russia. Then there will be a big long break from live streams, okay, beginning June 13th. And I will be back in July, early July, to continue the program. All right. All right, everybody. That is it for me. I just want to say shout outs to all the moderators, okay? Shout outs to all of the shout out to the moderators. Who else? Shout out to all the YouTube members in the audience. Sherry, I see you. Okay. Shout out to all those sending super chats. I'll just name you really quickly. I think they're coming in right now. Global Prosperity, thank you so much. Sigdem Donmez, thank you so much. Veso Yankov, thank you so much. And Summer of 1970, thank you so much. There was a question there. Why are liberal American chauvinists sensitive about gender pronouns but not sensitive to the right of development of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea? I will say this, we have a situation where on the one hand, I think we cannot deny that over the course of history, gender oppression is a very real thing. All right. We cannot deny that. But at the same time, what has happened is that because these struggles have been easily co-opted, because these issues, those who are concerned about them, have been channeled into pretty acceptable means of protest, we've had nefarious forces, those who promote wars, those who like to blind our eyes to wars, essentially direct people in this way. And so I like to say it's not about that one issue is not legitimate. It's that there is, or that we can't even coexist. If we agree or don't agree, just let people be and try to construct a society that is able to both tolerate differences and things like this, while at the same time unite on key issues like war. And that is just not happening because liberals are yes, they're chauvinists, they're imperialists. Liberals are the hallmark of the founding doctrine of American empire. I mean, that has just been the case since history has developed here. So, and that has been the correlation of class forces that has existed in the United States. And so we have to, and in the West, so we have to contend with this. And of course, in this modern era, it gets really dicey and tricky when we have legitimate problems on the home front with things like domestic violence and with things like racial discrimination on the other side. You know, these are real problems. But then we also have those who are trying to direct us away from the real problems, even on these issues, get us into acceptable means of political participation, like supporting one neocon, one duopoly oligarch party over the other. And then we are, of course, led to the fact that all of these forces in the ruling elite, they want war, 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 and more war. And so how do we penetrate and bust that reality for the people? How do we get people to break from that reality? Because to me, it's the most important one. But I do not denigrate anyone's particular issues, even if I do find, especially among liberal elites, that it's so annoying that they push this down our throats. I find that to be very frustrating as well, given that, you know, there's a difference between having empathy and having, a changing world and changing societies and all of this and changing viewpoints on these issues. There's a difference between that and building that kind of tolerance and acceptance versus, turning this into a kind of corporate political agenda that leads us into an abyss. That's what I think is really important to state here. But nonetheless, everyone, salute to all of you. Okay, salute, salute, salute. I'm out of here. Take good care, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern with Mark Sloboda. Do not miss it. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.